Hi everyone, I'm Andrew Hong. I'm going to present today Charles Taylor and Rousseau on Republicanism and political fragmentation, so from a social ontological perspective. First of all, I would like to introduce Rousseau and Taylor on their idea of political freedom. For Rousseau, he proposes to establish a free community of equals through social contract. Citizens in the civil society would lose natural liberty, but in return they will gain proprietorship of their possession, civil liberty, and moral liberty. And Taylor, he argues for opportunity concept and exercise concept of freedom. So, as you know, for Isaac Berlin, he has distinguished two kinds of liberty. First is negative liberty, and second is positive liberty. And for Rousseau, in the state of nature, there's natural liberty, but once you have entered into the political society, you have lost natural liberty, and what you have got is civil liberty and moral liberty. And civil liberty is similar to Berlin's negative liberty, and moral liberty is similar to Berlin's positive liberty. And moral liberty is what Isaac Berlin criticized, seriously criticized as a dangerous concept. And for Taylor, he also you can say he's following Isaac Berlin. He also agreed that there's two kinds of liberty, but he rather changed it as a kind of opportunity concept of freedom and exercise concept of freedom. I think the concept is very much similar to negative liberty and positive liberty, but just different names. For Rousseau and Taylor, he is also they have also argued for republicanism. For instance, for Rousseau, to ensure that the legislation is really based upon common interests rather than particular interests, he insists that we have to legislate based on common good according to the general will. Is to discover the general will, citizens should actively participate in the sovereign and the legislative assembly. This is the existence of freedom. Taylor also argues for the Republican thesis, which emphasizes that society should be bound together by patriotism in exercising collective self-rule or exercising collective freedom, positive freedom. This means that the free citizens should participate in democratic decision-making, animated by a sense of patriotism. Rousseau and Taylor, you can see, are very much similar on the idea of republicanism, or you may also say Republican thesis is also a kind of collective positive freedom. For Rousseau, and now we are going to talk about the differences. For Rousseau, all legislated laws must be based on common good guided by the general will. And Taylor rather considers the common good as identification of the law, the democratic institutions, and practice of the political system. You can say this. Taylor is referring to a negative. He's basically referring to understanding of democracy. So Taylor allows individuals to have different values apart from the common good, democratic institutions, and practices. In comparison with Rousseau, we can say that Taylor endorses the theory of common good. Unlike Rousseau will argue that we have to we have to search for common good guided by the general will. So for Taylor, you will think Rousseau's common good is too thick. In my wordings, or maybe we can say based on John Locke's concept, probably for Taylor is too thick for general common good generated by the general is too thick, and he's trying to find some minimal common goods. However, the Trump-Biden presidential contest in the 2020 US election shows that if the political division and polarization are very, very serious, democracy based on thinking and common good is viable. Let us first look at Taylor's criticism of Rousseau's general will. Taylor criticized Rousseau's moral freedom as the most dangerous form of positive freedom, because it's closely tied to the general will. It leaves no room for individual differentiation. So you can say he's although Taylor defends for concept freedom, exercise concept freedom. However, he still found that Rousseau's no freedom is dangerous because he has linked up the common good with the general will. It leaves no room for individual differentiation. Many scholars, such as I believe, also ascribe the tyranny of French devotion to Rousseau's concept. However, I would say that such criticism are not fair to Rousseau. The cause of, first of all, the cause of the tragedy of the French Revolution seems to be political fermentation, the lack of human self-insert, rather than because of his idea of positive liberty. And furthermore, for Rousseau, the sovereign can only make claim on individuals for matters that are important for the community. It has nothing to do with private matters. It means that for Rousseau, he will distinguish some things common and public, and some things just private. And what he concerned, what the general will concerns, only those are public, common good, public. It has nothing to do with the private matters. So we cannot say that it leaves no room for individual differentiation. And let's look at the problem of political fragmentation in the US election. Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump with the 202 electoral college vote in the 2020 election. However, both sides criticized the other for undermining democracy. Trump and his supporters claim that there's ample evidence that there's great voter fraud. The election result, mass media and important US institutions have been manipulated by the deep state. On the other hand, for Democrat and anti-Trump protesters, Trump's allegation of massive voting fraud are evidenceless. And Taylor acknowledges that political fragmentation is a serious problem of contemporary democracy. It's kind of a rift where groups become less willing to function based on a common understanding with the majority. For Taylor, the rise of political fragmentation is partly caused by an increasing pluralistic culture and overemphasis on the division of power and weakening sense of patriotism. The case of the 2020 US election seems to show that the cause of political fragmentation is due to pluralistic culture, but not lack of patriotism or political participation. In a study conducted by Pew Research Center, 1 month before the election, about 80% of the registered voters in the two camps stated that their disagreement with the other side was about core American values, and about 10% in both camps feared that the other's victory would cause lasting harm to the United States. So the point is that it seems that both are patriotic. They also care about the democracy in the United States. However, they just lack of mutual trust, which will blame each other for undermine democracy, for making fraud or undermine democracy. This lead to mutual hostility between two camps. Some commentators even worried that it may eventually lead to civil war. The polarization in the US seems to indicate that a thin theory of common good that simply emphasizing common allegiance to the democratic political system cannot sustain itself in the long run. I argue that Rousseau's idea of the general will, which aims at preventing political fragmentation, can still play a role in contemporary democracy. And I suggest to understand the general will, Rousseau's idea of general will in political deliberation, as a kind of collective mental status or social moral cognition based on self-understanding as involved in mutual dependent, shared cooperative political activity. It's kind of a collective intentionality by which it's not simply that I intend to fund the common good, but that we intend to fund the common good. Michael Bergman argues that such shared intentional activity requires three conditions. First, the participants are mutually responsive to the intentions and action of each other. the participants have an appropriate commitment to such joint activity, and they are committed to providing support to each other to play their role. Rousseau's idea of the general will can also be understood that each of us has a we intention as distinct from I intention. John Searle insists that such we intention is irreducible to I intention. It is not the summation of individual I intention. With mutual response in deliberation, citizens can form a shared we intention, that is the general will, by which the common good found in the assembly is not something for you and for me, but yes for us. With such understanding, the general will is not a set of rules for deliberation, but rather a social moral cognition by which the intentions and ideas are mutually shaped and a new kind of social reality is formed. With such understanding, the general will is not a set of rules for deliberation, but rather a social moral condition by which the intentions and ideas are mutually shaped and a new kind of social reality is formed. Cultivating civil intentionality does not necessarily require coercion. It can be brought about through the experience of substantive public deliberation and civil education, and even certain public ritual and collective events and festivals. And I suggest to cultivate people's through transcultural civil education. According to Taylor's and Gadamer's hermeneutics, our judgment inevitably involves a certain framework or horizon of significance or what Gadamer calls prejudice, which is shaped by cultural community. In order to form the shared we intention, the general will, with people of different moral cultural identities, civil education must aim at developing a transcultural vision by which students are called not only to understand their own cultural political values, but also to engage other unfamiliar life forms. In such dialogue, students are required to understand others sympathetically without attempting to win over others. Their original moral frameworks will also be challenged, and then they may reflect on and revise their own frameworks in the process of communication. Hopefully, a new hybrid framework through fusion of horizons will be formed, which triggered continuous changes in people's understanding of others and the world, and the formation of the shared intention, the general will can be achieved. In conclusion, in this paper, I've compared Rousseau's and Taylor's political philosophy and found similarities and differences between their positive freedoms. I've also examined Taylor's criticism of Rousseau's idea of general will, and I argue that Taylor's criticism is not fair. He has neglected Rousseau's distinction between private and public matters. The tyranny that occurred in the French Revolution was due to other social issues and misinterpretation of rather than supported by Rousseau's philosophy. In the face of political fragmentation in contemporary democracy, I argue that Taylor's theory of common good is no longer sufficient to sustain a viable democracy. On the contrary, I argue that a revised version of Rousseau's general will, inspired by the idea of collective intentionality and Taylor-Gadamerian hermeneutics, can help to fight against political fragmentation in contemporary democracy. Okay, thanks, and welcome for any comments.